In the dazzling streets of ancient Rome, beyond the marble columns and golden halls, lived a shadowed world that history rarely dares to remember. We praise Rome for its mighty armies, its grand temples, its legal systems that shaped Western civilization. But beneath this glory, there were those who paid an unspeakable cost to uphold its splendor. Among them were young men, many just boys, who were forced into lives they never chose. They were not simply servants or workers. These were male concubines, trapped in a system that exploited their bodies and silenced their voices. Stripped of freedom, they were used to satisfy the desires of Rome's most powerful citizens. Lives challenge the polished image we often hold of the Roman Empire. For behind the statues and triumphs was a brutal truth that to be young, beautiful, and powerless in Rome was to live at the mercy of others. Rome's understanding of intimacy, love, and ownership was not what we know today. Where we now see consent, they saw status. Where we see rights, they saw control. Everything, including human closeness, was measured by power. At the lowest rungs of this hierarchy were the concubines. Many came from distant lands, prisoners of war, children born into slavery, or sons sold to repay family debts. They weren't chosen for their minds, but for their faces, their skin, their build. Their value lay in how pleasing they looked to the eye. These young men, sometimes no older than 13 or 14, were sold at markets where their bodies were inspected like animals. Wealthy Romans browsed these auctions the way one might browse goods, poking, prodding, negotiating. A boy's birthplace, complexion, and figure decided his fate. Greek boys were praised for their learning and elegance. Boys from the north for their pale skin and strong frames. No one asked what they wanted. Their fear meant nothing. Once bought, they entered lives ruled by silent obedience. They were not allowed to rest unless told, not allowed to refuse what was demanded. They had to appear pleased always, no matter how they were used. Their smiles were forced, their manners were trained. Their survival depended on performing the illusion of consent. In some homes, they were clothed in silk, taught to read poetry, and dined on silver plates. But this luxury was hollow. It came with a cost. Every comfort was a chain. These gifts were meant to keep them dependent, quiet, and afraid to lose favor. Others were not so lucky. Some lived in cramped, hidden rooms. They were summoned only when their master desired them, then dismissed like tools once the pleasure was done. They owned nothing, not even their time, their thoughts, or their names. Privacy didn't exist. Escape was a dream that turned quickly to a nightmare if attempted. Roman law, which gave rights even to some slaves, offered these concubines no shield. They lived in a legal void, neither protected nor acknowledged. Their masters could do as they pleased, and no court would intervene. They had no one to run to, no one to hear them, no one to care. Worse than the physical pain was the slow erosion of their identity. Masters used psychological tactics to break their spirit. Sometimes, a kind gesture, a gift, a compliment, a day of freedom would be given. Then, just as quickly, it would be taken away. This created confusion, fear, uncertainty. The concubine never knew whether tomorrow held punishment or praise. Many were kept away from others, forbidden to form bonds, friendships, or attachments. This isolation crushed their sense of self. They had no mirrors to reflect who they once were, only the cold eyes of a master who owned them. In homes where more than one concubine existed, cruelty often took the shape of competition. Masters pitted them against one another, encouraging jealousy and rivalry. A kind word to one was a weapon against another. This prevented unity, because unity could lead to rebellion, to closeness, to strength. Some concubines were taught to debate, to play music, to recite epic poems, not for their own growth, but to amuse those who owned them. Education became another cage. They were made into polished ornaments, expected to entertain at dinners, to flatter guests, to speak when spoken to and vanish when dismissed. Even their appearance was tightly controlled. They had to follow strict diets, keep their skin flawless, their hair styled, their bodies fit and desirable. Some underwent painful procedures to alter how they looked, surgeries performed without medicine, without consent, without mercy, all to better suit someone else's vision of beauty. They were dressed in fine robes, decorated with gold, made to sparkle in the candlelight. But these beautiful things were not signs of status, they were signs of possession. Living dolls, paraded through salons and gardens, but always watched, always owned. Even travel, something we might think of as a privilege, became another chain. Concubines often accompanied their masters to distant provinces, but they did not see the world. As travelers, they were taken like luggage, there to serve in every place, expected to adapt, perform, and remain silent no matter where they were taken. Within the household, their status was always unclear. Other slaves often viewed them with suspicion or scorn, seeing their role as shameful. Free family members saw them only as distractions, temporary amusements, not worthy of real attention. But perhaps the deeper sorrow was felt far away in the villages and homes they were taken from. Families who lost sons to slavery often never found out what became of them. Mothers prayed, fathers searched, siblings waited, unaware that their child had been turned into property. For some, the loss came not through force, but through desperation. In times of hunger or debt, families were sometimes forced to give up a son to save the others. Imagine the pain to choose which child would survive, which one would be sacrificed. That decision left wounds that time could never heal. And for the young men sold this way, the guilt was unbearable. They knew why they had been chosen. They knew the price their families had paid, and the role they now had to play to justify it. A few tried to escape. Desperate, afraid, but determined, they ran. But the punishments for escape were brutal. Public beatings, torture, humiliation. The message was clear: you are not a person, you are property, and property does not leave. Some sought a more final escape, suicide, but even that freedom was denied. Masters, knowing the value they had paid, kept their concubines under constant watch. Anything that could be used to end their life was removed. No ropes, no blades, no privacy. Not even death belonged to them. These stories are rarely told. They are buried in the shadows of Rome's glowing history, hidden beneath tales of glory and grandeur. But they matter, because behind every empire's rise, there are those whose suffering built the foundations. And if we celebrate the marble, we must also remember the blood that stained it. In the heart of ancient Rome, religion was everywhere. Temples stood tall in every district. Statues of gods lined public squares. Citizens prayed to Jupiter for justice, to Mars for strength, to Vesta for protection. But for the young men forced into concubinage, these gods offered no refuge, no voice, no comfort, no deliverance. Though Roman society claimed to worship ideals like justice and virtue, the divine protections spoken of in temples never reached the concubines' quarters. These boys, often voiceless, often nameless, were invisible to the gods of Rome. Their pain did not disturb the rituals. Their cries did not echo in the prayers. Some of them turned in secret to foreign religions, small cults and mystery, faiths whispered among slaves and outsiders. These hidden traditions promised healing, escape, or at least meaning in the suffering. But even this small spiritual lifeline came with risk. Their masters controlled everything: their food, their movements, their appearance, and even their beliefs. Practicing a forbidden faith could bring punishment, or worse, suspicion that they had minds of their own. Their existence was a transaction, a market built on skin and silence. The wealthier Roman elites competed in acquiring the most beautiful, the most talented, the most exotic concubines. It wasn't about companionship. It was about status. A boy with golden hair or soft skin became a symbol of power, a display of taste, wealth, and reach. Demand drove the trade. Prices soared. Traders scoured the provinces for new faces too. Sell. The more dehumanized the system became, the more profitable it was. There were even places, institutions, where boys were prepared for this life in advance. Training schools, not unlike those that molded gladiators for battle, existed, to turn children into perfect companions. But instead of teaching them to fight, they taught them how to submit, how to smile without joy, how to listen without opinion, how to endure without resistance. The training was not just physical, it was psychological. These children were shaped from the inside out, stripped of identity, and rebuilt to suit the tastes of strangers. They were taught to flatter, to serve, to entertain, not to live. Many were enrolled in these schools before their voices had even deepened. Boys, still developing their sense of self, were handed over to a system that erased it. They never had a chance to build dreams, explore who they were, or discover what it meant to love or be loved freely. Across the vast empire, from Britannia to Syria, the treatment of concubines varied. In some places, they were given marginally better living conditions. In others, they faced harsher discipline, stricter isolation, and fewer rights. But no matter. The province, the core truth remained unchanged. They had no freedom. No say their bodies were owned, and their futures were dictated by whims they could not predict. And then came the passage of time, their worst enemy. Because in Rome, beauty was a currency with an expiration date. As these boys grew older, as their youthful features faded, so did their value. They were no longer treasures, they were burdens. Many were cast out. No longer useful, they were sold to other households. Places with fewer resources, harsher rules, and more violent punishments. Others were simply discarded, left to wander the streets with no skills, no money, and no sense of the world outside servitude. Some were sent into general slavery, stripped of even the slight privileges they once held. Others were abandoned altogether, ghosts of the empire that once owned them. Rarely, very rarely, a former concubine might gain his freedom through luck, strategy, or the rare goodwill of a master. A few managed to escape the system. Some reinvented themselves entirely, taking on new names and disappearing into the crowded cities of the empire. But freedom did not erase the scars. These men carried deep emotional wounds, mistrust, fear, confusion about their worth. They had to rebuild their souls from pieces, and most never fully healed. Medical care, when given, was cold and calculated. Masters invested money into their concubines. A sick or injured boy meant a loss in value. So physicians were called when needed, not out of concern, but to protect property. Cuts were treated, infections managed, weight maintained, but mental anguish, that was ignored. As long as they smiled and looked pretty, nothing else mattered. The society that built this system believed in honor, loyalty, courage, but only for those born free. A Roman nobleman might speak of duty and virtue, while casually abusing a boy whose only crime was being born in the wrong place with the wrong face. Concubines were not part of Rome's moral world. They were beneath its ethics, outside its conscience to survive. These boys had to become actors. They learned how to read the slightest change in a master's expression. They knew how to avoid a beating, how to earn a compliment, how to predict when they might be used or ignored. Their very survival depended on performance, the appearance of gratitude, the illusion of contentment. Every day was a quiet war, a battle fought with smiles instead of swords. Their world followed the seasons. During festivals like Saturnalia or Lupercalia, households filled with guests. Masters expected their concubines to entertain, to perform, to charm, to dance, or sing or recite poetry. These moments might appear glamorous to outsiders, but to the boys trapped in them, they were humiliating spectacles. On quieter days, there was rest, but also fear. A calm moment often signaled the coming of a storm. Within these closed environments, whispers traveled carefully. When allowed, concubines developed subtle ways to communicate. A glance, a hand signal, a half-spoken word. These small networks of solidarity offered rare comfort. A warning about a master's temper, a shared memory, a moment of laughter in secret. These connections were fragile and dangerous, but they reminded them they weren't alone. The reach of this system stretched far beyond the walls of Roman villas. The very acceptance of such cruelty normalized other horrors. If it was acceptable to own and use a child, then what else could be justified? Gladiator fights, public executions, crushing slave rebellions. A society that dehumanized concubines easily turned a blind eye to other forms of violence. Archaeological remains give us glimpses, bracelets that might have marked ownership, locks from rooms with no windows, grooming tools, decorative items, designed to flatter rather than function, small silent clues of large, loud suffering. In literature, male concubines are rarely named. They are hinted at, described in passing. Euphemisms shield the reader from the ugly truth. But if you read carefully between the lines, you see them. Young, trapped, fading into the background of noble lives, their stories hidden in shadows. One of the most harrowing experiences a concubine could face was being sold from one master to another. Each sale meant a new life, new dangers, new rules, new performances. It was like being reborn into a nightmare over and over again. A kind master could be replaced by a cruel one. A house with music and light could become a dungeon. In some cases, the master lost interest. Boredom was a sentence worse than punishment. Boys were either sold quickly or pushed into other roles: cooks, servants, laborers. Their pasts were forgotten, their futures uncertain. In others, the master grew attached. But even this attachment did not mean safety. It still rested on dominance. It still ignored the boy's will. At best, it brought routine. At worst, it brought obsession. Seasonal migration from summer villas to winter estates meant the concubines were constantly uprooted. They lived nowhere. They belonged nowhere. The faces changed. The rules shifted. But the role stayed. The same, always beneath, always watched. And the cruelest irony of all, These boys were taught to love beauty, but never allowed to create it. They learned music, but could not compose. They read poetry, but could not write. Their minds were filled with culture, not for their own enlightenment, but for the amusement of others. They were living libraries, breathing instruments, carriers of knowledge, never its owners. Even their bodies were shaped against their will. Forced exercise, harsh diets, painful grooming, surgeries with no anesthesia, all to please another's desire. Festivals brought even more pressure. Elaborate performances were demanded. Smiles were painted on their faces. But inside, many felt only fear. The fear of being chosen, of being displayed, of being used again. This was not a life. It was a performance, one that never ended. And as the music played in Roman halls, somewhere in the shadows, a concubine stood silent, waiting for the next act to begin. In the Roman household, a concubine's life was one of quiet tormentor luxury on the surface, isolation underneath. Though some lived in fine chambers and wore beautiful fabrics, everyone around them understood a brutal truth. Their place in the home depended solely on the favor of their master. That favor could shift without warning. And so, forming real friendships or romantic bonds was nearly impossible. Trust was dangerous. Attachment could cost them everything. These young men came from faraway lands captured, bought and traded through vast regional networks that stretched across the Mediterranean and beyond. The routes that delivered them into Roman homes were soaked in suffering. Wars were fought for profit. People were kidnapped. Families were torn apart. Debt slavery swallowed the poor, all to supply Rome's elite with fresh bodies to control. Behind the walls of Roman villas, the training of a concubine wasn't just about learning to serve. It was about breaking a person down, shaping their mind, turning fear into obedience. Over time, Roman masters and their agents became skilled in psychological manipulation. They studied weakness, like science, using isolation, flattery, punishment, and reward to chip away at resistance and create total dependence. It wasn't training, it was mental conquest. Every part of a concubine's identity was reshaped to reflect their owner's desires. Even the clothes they wore weren't their own. They were symbols, displays of wealth, power, and control. Jewels and fine fabrics glittered in candlelight, but they also marked submission. A collar of gold was still a collar, and behind the silks, their own bodies were constantly reshaped, groomed, altered. Medical and cosmetic procedures were forced upon them, painful, invasive, and often permanent. Their skin, their hair, their very scent, none of it was truly theirs. Every detail was tailored to someone else's fantasy. Their consent never mattered. Growing up in this world robbed them of essential human experiences. Concepts like freedom, healthy boundaries, or even personal choice became alien. They were taught that love could be bought, that worth depended on beauty, and that silence was survival. Even if they were eventually released or escaped their servitude, the damage endured. Freedom did not erase trauma. Social contact was tightly controlled. Masters understood that unity bred rebellion. So, concubines were isolated, cut off from others, stripped of community, denied the support that might have given them strength. This isolation wasn't accidental. It was a method, a wall built to keep them obedient. In the Roman economy, everything had a price, even a human life. Concubines were evaluated like goods in a market. Age, origin, skin tone, grooming, obedience, musical skill, every trait impacted their value. This process of turning people into products made it easier to treat them as disposable. Their worth lasted only as long as their appeal. But this wasn't just about individual cruelty. The entire system reflected a deeper cultural sickness. A civilization that could normalize the abuse of vulnerable boys had already lost its moral compass. It was a society willing to look away to permit injustice, to preserve the illusion of order, and yet, not every concubine accepted their fate. In rare, flickering moments of resistance, some dared to speak, to run, to fight. These acts, though often punished brutally, were expressions of the one thing their captors could never fully extinguish: the human spirit. Rome's temples and forums echoed with discussions of honor, ethics, and virtue. Philosophers debated justice, senators wrote laws, but none of that protected concubines. The same society that praised reason and morality upheld systems of brutal exploitation without shame. Without irony, Roman life followed a seasonal rhythm. Feasts, festivals, and ceremonies came in waves, and with them, increased demands on concubines. These periods brought longer hours, harsher expectations, and greater scrutiny. Even during quiet months, concubines lived with the dread of what was to come. Back in the provinces and villages where many of these young men were taken from, their loss left scars. Entire families were shattered. Communities mourned children who vanished, never to return. The concubine trade didn't just harm individuals, it fractured entire cultures over generations. Rome perfected the tools of mental control. Every technique was refined, tested, and passed down, and it worked. It created obedience, but the cost was devastating. These men were stripped of their autonomy, their identity, their ability to dream. Some never recovered physically or emotionally. In the eyes of Roman law, concubines were not people. They were property. As such, they had no legal protection, no rights, no voice. If they were abused, society looked away. If they were killed, justice did not follow. Their pain became invisible, written out of the law, and eventually out of history. The system fed itself. The more profitable the trade became, the more incentive there was to continue it. The demand never stopped. And so, the cycle of capture, conditioning, and control went on generation after generation. No reform ever came. No moral awakening disrupted the machine. The physical training of concubines included posture, movement, touch, but the deeper training, the one that left the most lasting damage, was psychological. It taught these boys to doubt themselves, to fear rejection, to seek approval even when it hurt. In time, many forgot who they had been before, even those who found a way out through age, favor, or purchase often carried invisible wounds for life. The trauma did not end with their service. In many cases, it simply changed shape. As we look back at these lives, so often ignored by history, we must remember, behind each statistic, there was a soul, a person with thoughts, with dreams, with a name that was erased. These were not background characters. They were human beings whose experiences revealed deep, painful truths about power, cruelty, and survival. The grandeur of Rome, its columns, its sculptures, its golden age was built atop the suffering of the voiceless. Concubines were part of that foundation, and until we reckon with that truth, our view of history remains incomplete. These stories matter not because they shock us, but because they challenge us. They ask us to look beyond the surface of greatness and see what was sacrificed to build it. They force us to ask, who pays the price for progress? And more than that, they challenge us to reflect on our present, on the systems we still accept, on the people we still ignore. The parallels may be uncomfortable, but they are real. Power still silences. Profit still blinds. Rome's elite could justify almost anything because the victims were quiet, hidden, or dismissed as inferior. Today, we face the same danger, when the powerful treat human beings as tools for their pleasure, when societies turn away from suffering in the name of tradition or economy, the cycle repeats. That is why we must speak. These names, though most have been lost, we must tell their stories, though they were never written down. In doing so, we return their humanity. We give them back the dignity that Rome tried to take. To remember them is not to linger on tragedy, but to honor resilience. These young men endured a world designed to break them, and yet some found moments of connection, flashes of defiance, slivers of hope. Their strength was quiet, but it mattered. Their lives remind us of what civilization should protect. Marble, not glory, but people, and so the concubines of ancient Rome should not be remembered as curiosities of the past, but as enduring testaments to human endurance. Their suffering was real. Their silence was not consent. And their legacy, if we are willing to face, it can help shape a more just future. Because history is not just what we celebrate, it's also what we choose to remember or forget.